so I think what he indicated that he wanted to do is for our purposes now, for the discussion about Israel-Palestine, to kind of start out with sort of a 10-minute, deal. Is that still what you want to do, Spencer?
Yeah, that was the idea. I don't have a good 10-minute statement though. I went through like a dozen of them. They were all crap. So
Okay.
Let's just jump into it. Let's just see what happens.
Sure. Okay.
I should warn you, I prepared for this by watching a 5-minute Dennis Prager video on YouTube. So now that you know what you're up against, it's not too late to back down.
Okay, fair enough. Well, sorry for wasting your time.
All right. So we'll, I guess, begin with the Gish Gallop, and then the ad hominems, and then we'll end in a indecipherable crosstalk or something like that.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. No, look, I have obviously, I have a very particular, strong perspective on this. I wrote a short book pamphlet, called 4 Essays on Palestine, that got into what I think about this. I know I've certainly seen enough from you in the past to know that there are some real disagreements here on this bundle of issues that I hope kind of come out over the course of the conversation. But honestly, I think the people who I have had on or done things at third-party venues to talk about this subject with are Walter Block, Destiny, Brianna Wu, and you, and you're just by far my favorite of those 4 people, right? So
let me begin by saying why I disagree with Walter Block. Maybe that's a good place.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do it.
Because I found myself I agree with a lot of his conclusions, but some of his arguments are I'm not there with that. Okay. So I am pro-Israel. I will endorse Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And yes, Ben, that means I will take the deplorability challenge and say, yeah, it has a right to be a Jewish state, or a legitimate interest in being a Jewish state. So with Walter Block's perspective, he's very historically based, and I hear this from a lot of other pro-Israel people of well, the Jews were there for thousands of years and stuff. I don't think that's the right line to take. And my suspicion of that kind of reasoning is, even if you know that you've got original ownership in a normatively significant sense of this piece of land by this people, do we know that it's transmitted hundreds of years, all those generations through diaspora? I just find that really suspect. And the other thing that I thought was suspicious about it is, if I could ask him one question, it would be, because he made the point that the Temple Mount is under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Jews were there before the Muslims were there. Okay, fair enough. So imagine though that further archaeological investigation discovered there's a still deeper structure that was built by the still more ancient ancestors of the Palestinians. Would he completely flip his position? I mean, I don't know. My suspicion is that people who make these historical arguments, it's the tail wagging the dog. It's not really that's leading them to their conclusions. You see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's almost certainly right. I think that people who say things like that, I think it's just extremely unlikely that they would endorse, by parity of reasoning, right? If you had, if there was some group of Native Americans, who'd been living in Europe, who were in a position to sort of come back and stage an armed takeover of some part of the United States and, found an ethno-state there. I'm politely skeptical of the idea that very many people who say this would be fine with that, even though that's a much more recent, that's a much more recent claim. But, to me, this sort of broader issue in all of this is the one you kind of alluded to before, right? You said you believe that Israel has a right to exist, and then you said you believe it has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And my feeling has always been, right, that when I hear people throw around this phrase, Israel has a right to exist, it always seems like it's designed to evoke the sort of scenario of that right being taken away through armed conquest, maybe even genocide against Israelis. Like that's the sort of thing that phrase Israel's right to exist tends to conjure up, right? But then the actual thing that people are using it to say more often than not is much better captured by the fuller phrase that you used, right? Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, right? That so what they're really saying is that Israel has a right to exist, not just in the sense that it has a right not to be invaded or wiped out, nuclear strike or something, but that it has a right to have its current ethnic majority forever, right? And so maybe just on a real baseline level, right? I mean, this might already get us into the disagreement, because it doesn't seem to me that any state has that right. Like I don't think I don't think that the United States has a right to have a permanent white majority or a permanent Christian majority. It just that doesn't seem to me to be a legitimate goal of a state. I think people, right, individual people have rights, right, and but ultimately, right, a state, right, this is just sort of very basic, like what I would think of as sort of ABCs of liberal democracy stuff, right? Like a state should be the state of everybody who lives there, right? Not just of a particular ethnic group or even the majority ethnic group, right? I mean, states should be states of everybody, right? When you say that a state should exist for a particular ethnic group, like even before you get into the other sort of 20 steps that would take you from there to all the problems that I have with Israel and Zionism, like that already starts to set off alarm bells in my head. But my sense is that your position on this is very different.
Yeah, I think it is. I guess I'm curious, what do you think should delineate political communities? Or do you think nothing should? Do you think there should just be like one cosmopolitan political community? Is that your position?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think ultimately, if we just sort of had the Star Trek Federation, that would be, best, right? That would be much better, accepting that the world is going to be, organized into nation states for the foreseeable future. I would point out, right, that, most actually existing nationalisms are somewhere on a spectrum between pure ethno-nationalism and pure civic nationalism, right? So in pure civic nationalism, the sort of boundaries of the nation are whoever lives, within the border of the nation. In pure ethno-nationalism, the nation is a blood and soil thing. It's constituted by shared ancestry, peoplehood, and and again, there's a spectrum here. I think there are very few like absolutely pure cases one way or the other. I think the United States is actually very close at this point in its history to pure civic nationalism. And to my mind, that's like by far the best thing about the United States. Like if I have, something I've said before that like I think often sounds funny before I elaborate it, right, to people who kind of know what my position is that, there's a certain sense in which nothing makes me feel more patriotic than thinking about Israel, by which I don't mean that I sort of swell up with pride over the fact that we're, sending them 2,000-pound bombs to drop on refugee camps and dismembered children. That makes me sick. But like, by which I mean that I'm just sort of intensely grateful that the Jewish side of my family, when it was time to get the fuck out of Tsarist Russia, ended up here and not there, right? So I got to grow up in a secular, multi-ethnic democracy because, to my mind, that's just so clearly a superior kind of society, right? That's the kind of best thing about American identity, that it's so relatively separated from ethnicity, right? Nobody ever says they're a quarter American, right? That would kind of sound like a category mistake. And then I think when you get into places like France, right, that might be like, a few notches more towards ethno-nationalism, but still pretty close to the U.S. end of the spectrum, for example. And when you think about Israel and Zionism, I mean that is a almost completely pure form of ethno-nationalism. In fact, the way that Zionists talk about nations and peoples having nations and all of that stuff really often sounds like a relic from a previous century, because it is, right? I mean, Zionism is essentially a form of 19th century romantic nationalism, a kind that was very common in Europe at the time. But I think that most Westerners, I hope, have by the 21st century, kind of realized is bad news, right? That led to to a lot of the worst horrors, certainly of the 20th century, right? But like the idea is this is the state of a people, no matter whether like explicitly, right? Both the ones who live there and the ones who don't, and very, very explicitly not other groups who form like even a very large percentage of the population, that is even very liberal Zionists are very explicit about saying like, oh, the reason we need to have a two-state solution is that otherwise the wrong ethnic group would eventually become a majority, and we could never have that, right? That it's like, we'll be just very, very explicit that it's really, really important, right, above all else, that the minority group within the population is never allowed to become a majority group. And even before you get into what has to happen in order to achieve that in the context of Israel-Palestine, even that goal, right, strikes me as a fundamentally illegitimate goal. So, I mean, I guess one way to just pose this is just say, look, I mean, if somebody told you, right, if one of your fellow Americans told you, oh, I think it's really, really important that, white people be a majority of the United States population forever, that, when we think about how immigration policy works, et cetera, that it's like very important that it conforms to that goal. I mean, would that strike you as fundamentally illegitimate? And not just like, look, I mean, I understand you wouldn't agree with it, right? Like,
I wouldn't agree with it. It wouldn't strike me as fundamentally illegitimate in the same way that it strikes you.
Okay, interesting.
I think, there were all of these books coming out by these like left-wing intellectuals at the end of the 90s that were like anxious about multiculturalism and stuff. And one of them was The Disuniting of America by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And he said the 21st century is going to be about what keeps a nation together. And that's worth thinking about, right? What makes a people feel like they're a people? That's sort of like, if you don't have that, you don't really have anything. And I think it makes sense in deciding what your political community is. This is a practical decision. It's not given in nature. It's not written in the human genome what our states are supposed to be or something like that. But I think it makes sense to go in the direction of what normal human inclinations are. And the fact is, we're quite groupish. We're quite sort of built to be more, to get along and to trust people who are more like us visibly, culturally, in different ways. And that can be overcome. And the harsh edges of that can be softened and need to be softened, right? In order for there to be civilization that isn't just completely cruel to those who are not part of the in-group. But I do think that there's this desire to utterly and completely transcend that everywhere. So in the US, you're right, we have a healthy civic nationalism. I don't want to replace that with an ethnic nationalism. I also don't think that it makes sense absolutely everywhere. And I think to condemn like Zionism or Israel in particular, I want to know, like, okay, what you said about it being a relic of the 19th century and all of that, that's true in a way, but like that would be true of a lot of other states, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be true of Japan. It would be true of a variety of other countries. And I think there are situations where you would start to have intuitions that would pull in this direction. Like, well, imagine like some small, just let me give this one point. So imagine there's some small African country and there are a bunch of, white people immigrating there from Europe, and after a while they're like, hey, like we're a minority here, like we don't, we feel like we don't have continuity with this country, wasn't what it was like culturally. There's some sense of loss here. There's some sort of anxiety of not being a majority in the same place. I think you would have some sympathy with that. And in fact, I think this is the big Palestinian complaint about early Zionism. Early Zionism, before the 48 war, before all of that, they did not wish to be an ethnic minority in the place that they lived for a long time. And I think, yeah, I can understand why they would feel that way.
Okay, I would not have the slightest bit of sympathy in the circumstances that you're describing, with a big caveat, right? So, in other words, if white people were coming to this country to live as equals, right, then I would have no sympathy for the complaint that what had been a minority population was becoming a majority population. I would hope few people would, but who knows, right? Maybe I'm overly optimistic there. Now, if they were coming with the explicit stated program of forming an exclusionary white ethno-state, then yeah, sure. Then I would be sympathetic to people being alarmed by that, right? But like I think there's a world of difference between just saying that what once was an ethnic minority will become an ethnic majority, and saying that there is this, people are coming and they're being sponsored by a political movement that says loudly and constantly, our goal is to form a exclusionary ethno-state for this group that's coming, right? That I think it's legitimate to alarm people, but I don't think it's legitimate to just be alarmed by the change, right? By just the fact that the ethnic composition is changing. I think that is a particularly bad and dangerous notion of political community. And I would also say that, to the extent that you're right, that that there's this sort of inborn tendency towards some level of tribalism, that to forming groups and outgroups, to have those be linked to to people who might look like us, who might have similar religious or linguistic markers, etc. I mean, I don't really understand saying that there's this tendency, therefore let's just run with it, right? I would think that the more people do have that inborn tendency, the more reason there is to be on guard against it. Because even if you can't get rid of it entirely, let's say, right, that you sort of take the kind of like standard kind of conservative position on a lot of issues on this, that there are just certain things about human nature that that it would be dangerous to try to overcome completely, right? That maybe can't be overcome completely, and we court disaster by trying to. And let's say we put it on that list. Okay, right? We're not going to make a big utopian effort to overcome it completely, but let's at least not sort of pour fuel on it by saying this is a state that's for this ethnic group, that they have that it's really important that this state have this ethnic majority until the end of time, that it would be a disaster if minority ethnic groups within the state ever became a majority, both because I think that's very wrong in principle, but also because I think that pragmatically, once you start pouring that fuel on it, then I think that those sharp edges that you were talking about earlier, like, start to get really sharp, right? I mean, like once you start sort of saying, like, we're not even going to like stigmatize that kind of feeling, we're not even going to have like the polite pretense that it's not there. We're gonna endorse it from the top of society very explicitly. Then it's a lot easier to see how you get to the point where the sorts of things that Israel has done are the kinds of things that the country's population will go along with, right? I mean, which are the kinds of things that you can only do if you really deeply dehumanize people who are outside of your ethnic community. I mean, things like ruling over millions of people for 58 years without ever offering them citizenship rights in your state, for the sole and explicit reason, right? I mean, no Israeli politician has ever been shy about like spelling this out, for the sole reason that if you gave these people who you intend to rule over forever, remember, I mean, that's the official position of the Israeli government, that there will never, ever be a two-state solution, that, these millions of people, that if you ever gave them citizenship rights, you can't do that because that would jeopardize the Jewish nature of the state, right? Never mind the kind of thing that's happened in the last year and a half, where millions of people are driven from their homes at gunpoint, where you have the largest population of child amputees in the world in a tiny area, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those are
there's a lot here.
Well, hold on, right? Like,
okay.
Let's just wrap up this one point, right? Those are the kinds of things, right? The reason that I don't think these are disconnected issues is that those are the kinds of things that you're a lot more likely to get people to go along with in a scenario where you have, like whatever kind of fires of tribalism are always burning in our hearts all the time, right? You've really poured gasoline on by saying, no, this is an explicitly ethnic state. It's really important that, that it have this ethnic group forever and ever and ever, right? Like, that seems like the kind of thing that's going to get you, make it far more likely that you're going to get the level of dehumanization that it takes to do those other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what kind of ethno-nationalism you're institutionalizing. But I'm also I want to go back to something you said way back at the early part of your last statement, which is, you said the difference between the scenario I described and early Zionism is that the whites who would be moving into whatever imaginary African country this is wouldn't be coming there with the intention of forming an exclusionary ethno-state. Okay, so I have a hard time seeing how the intention matters. So suppose you just have, in this alternate history, you imagine a bunch of people, just a bunch of Jews from various parts of the world decide they want to immigrate to Palestine. And it's foreseeable that they're going to become a majority, and it's foreseeable that once that they become a majority, they're going to want recognition as an independent state on part of that territory. You don't think that is precisely what the Arabs in that area were reacting against? Like they wouldn't have a complaint in that scenario?
Well, I think in the scenario where it was like the scenario where Jewish people were just going to become a majority, but Arabs were still going to be treated equally, I don't think there'd be a legitimate complaint. But that's not the scenario you just gave me, right? The scenario you just gave me was the one where, even if there's no intention, and I don't know how it would be foreseeable without this intention, but let's just run with it for the sake of argument, right? That where it's foreseeable that the consequence is going to be that there's going to be an attempt to force a partition of the country and the creation of an exclusionary ethno-state and part of it, right? It's like, yeah, I think that's something it's legitimate to be alarmed by. But if you just had a state in British mandatory Palestine, just became an independent state, at the end of the 1940s, and by the time that happened, let's say, there was so much Zionist immigration that was the majority of the state, but Arab inhabitants, were still treated as completely equal citizens. There was no attempt to sort of force by state policy, them never, becoming the majority ever again. There wasn't this population of hundreds of thousands of people who were ethnically cleansed, in 1947 to 8, and then weren't allowed to return. None of that stuff happened. That the only sort of adverse effect, right, of all of this immigration was just that the ethnic majority wasn't what an Arab ethno-nationalist would hope it was. Then no, in that case, I wouldn't think that Palestinians would have a legitimate complaint.
Okay, but I think realistically, if you had that amount of immigration, you're going to end up with a very different culture, very different society, and you have to say you just have to suck it up. You'd be willing to say that?
Well, it's certainly what I say about the United States, right? I mean, that they have when people express fear that if we, that if we let in, too many brown people, then, U.S. culture, will end up being fundamentally different. Or like when, Elon Musk and JD Vance go to Europe and they say, oh, you shouldn't let in too many immigrants from other countries into Germany because then German culture will be unrecognizable. I mean, in all of those instances, I do say, yeah, I don't think that fear of cultural change is a legitimate reason for denying anybody rights that they should otherwise have. I think that I think cultures change. I'm very unsympathetic to those complaints. Now, maybe you're just in general more sympathetic to that stuff, but if so, I think that would make your position more consistent than a lot of people's is, because it seems to me that, most sort of normie American liberals 100% share my intuition about this when it comes to the United States, when it comes to Western Europe, but not right. Not in the Israel-Palestine case, right? There's
This was your rant. This was your rant on my show.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think they can just say, can't those people just say, blah blah blah, non-ideal theory?
Okay, yeah. So I only half know what you mean when you say that, and I think a lot of I sort of halfway know, like, have a sense of what you're getting at when you say that. My suspicion is that insofar as this show aspires to reach at least a few people who aren't philosophy graduate students, other people might require more unpacking. So you want to just kind of take a minute on what you mean by that?
So I think that somebody who is a general cosmopolitan but is supportive of Israel retaining its Jewish character might say, given that the amount of injustices in the world, given the prevalence and extent of anti-Semitism, and that it doesn't seem to be going away anywhere soon, that Jewish people, in order to have protection and a sense of dignity, ought to have their own state. Something like that is what I'm putting. Whereas notice that my defense of Israel retaining its Jewish character is just part of a general. I think countries ought to be able to retain their cultures in the face of immigration and stuff like that. Whereas I'm putting on in the mouth of somebody who's more cosmopolitan this other defense that is a special case.
Sure. Well, I would just say that looking around the world, that would, I think, like, even putting aside whether, the truth of the premise would hypothetically, right, be enough to justify that. And maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But I mean, I would say my first response would just be that looking around the world, I think the premise is very obviously not true. I mean, like, that they have that there is a, not every country, don't get me wrong, right? Certainly not every country, but there is a very broad range of countries in the world where it is much safer to be Jewish than it is in Israel. Like not even close, right? I mean, that the people in the United States or Canada, Western Europe, right? It's like, yeah, it's not that nobody, ever dies for being Jewish. It's not like hate crimes don't exist. They certainly do. Tree of life, etc. Right? But it is not even a rounding error. I mean, it is a vanishingly, impossibly rare way to die. Certainly, whereas in a state where, precisely because you have an exclusionary ethno-state that can only be maintained by constant violence, precisely because of that, you have inevitable cycles of communal violence that make it comparatively much more dangerous to be Jewish.
The homicide rate in Israel is quite low. Last time I looked at it, and I guess probably the October 7th enough was to.
No, but I mean, even in the normal course of things, right? I mean, that they have like, you're going to, the sort of the danger of dying in ethnic conflict, right? Whether that goes in the homicide rate or not, right? I mean, like dying as a soldier in the IDF, right? Dying, in a terrorist attack. No, you're right. It is quite low overall. I mean, right? It's not like it's absolutely nothing like the danger of like innocent Palestinian civilians, being blown to bits, by the IDF, right? It's I mean, it's teensy tiny compared to that, but it's still massive compared to the danger of dying in an anti-Jewish hate crime in the United States. I mean, like it's like that that's something that almost never happens.
One thing to say here is there have been people who have immigrated to Israel from various parts of Europe for fear that this might not be a stable situation, for fear that, and notice that the situation for Jews in the U.S. did used to be a lot worse. So I think it's fair to say isn't the success of Jewish people in America kind of a response to the idea that this Zionist project was necessary? And maybe in retrospect,
you lost me in that last part. Can you redo that last sentence or explain it differently?
I've heard the point made that, look, Jewish people are doing fine in America. They don't need their own state or whatever, because look, we're doing fine over here. Well, that makes more sense from the perspective of 2020 than in like 1947 or something like that.
Well, certainly in 1947, the danger that you were going to die for being Jewish in the United States was nothing compared to the danger that you were going to die in the 1947-8 war. Sure,
but the thought that you needed to fight to establish some place where you'd have a state that's there to protect you. I find that credible.
I mean, honestly, I think if the United States had been less restrictionist about immigration during World War II, it's entirely possible that Israel wouldn't exist now, right? Like that they have because I think enough people would have been even then, right? I mean, you're certainly right that like anti-Semitism was far worse, in the 1940s, than it is now. There's certainly no arguing that, right? But like even with the degree of anti-Semitism that existed in the 1940s, I mean, this is the United States, even in the 1940s. Right, was a place that lots of Jewish people in lots of places were desperate to go to. Would give up a lot to go to. I mean, people, certainly, long before the 1940s, right? I mean, in the beginning of the 20th century, right? When my family came over. I mean, this is like already this like sort of great place of refuge even then, right? So I think if the United States had something a bit closer to an open borders policy for people who were considered to be culturally alien, in the early decades of the 20th century, right? I mean, that might have just kind of solved the problem all on its own. But I do think in general, right? I mean, that the idea, there are people who move from France or who move from the United States, to Israel, and who would give as part of the explanation, right, that it's that there's that things seem fine now, but you never know in the long term, right? There are all those cliches, right? Jews in Germany thought they were safe, all of this stuff. So that like there are people who do that, right? But one, that's a vanishingly small percentage of Jewish people who live in those places do that, right? And I suspect that in most cases, right, that's not really the main thing going on, right, in people who do make that decision, right? And I also think there's a really strange. It's always seemed to me that there's this really strange contradiction between two things that Zionists typically say about this, right? One is that, well, sure, for now, things are good in the United States, for example, but you never know, right? You look at the long sweep of Jewish history, you never know. It's possible that, in the future, the United States will be overtaken by like murderous Hitlerian anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, they'll say it's really, really important that the United States support Israel because it's like always on the brink of being wiped out, that because like we need to give all this funding to Israel because, that protects its right to exist. And it's always seemed to me that maybe not an outright contradiction, but there's at least quite a bit of tension between those two, right? That like it's really important that the United States continues to support Israel in order to safeguard its right to exist. And also, Israel needs to stay an exclusionary ethno-state forever because the United States, might become murderously anti-Semitic at any time.
I'll let those people sort out their own issues. I don't think I'm committed to saying that dyad. So, but you said earlier, I want to get back to what you said earlier. It sounds like you're saying what you were saying was, if there were a plan for people to move to a place and eventually become a majority and change the cultural character of the place and all of that, that could be fine so long as they were willing to treat other people as equals.
Yes.
So it does sound like your criticism of Zion as such just comes down to how are the Israelis treating the Arab Israeli citizens, and you would want to lump in the Palestinians with that, but am I right about that? So if it turns out that the Arabs are being treated fairly or reasonably fairly,
no, because I think that when I say, are you going to treat people as equals, right? Being treated as an equal means that the state is for you as much as it's for anybody else, right? You're not treating people as an equal if you say, like, if the United States, declared tomorrow that this is a white Christian state, we're going to put it in our documents, we're going to make people take oaths of fealty, like Israel does, to the idea of the United States as a white Christian state. We're going to do what Israel does and exclude parties from elections if they don't go along with the idea of the United States as a white Christian state, that everybody has to agree to that to even be allowed to participate in the political process. But don't worry, right? We'll still let black and brown people, be doctors and lawyers, and if they can be elected to Congress by parties that aren't too hostile to the idea of the United States as a permanently white Christian state, we'll even let them do that. I wouldn't say, oh, okay, no problem, right? Because people are being treated reasonably fairly, right? Like, what I mean by treated as equals is that the state is for them as much as it's for anybody else, that everybody has an equal status within the state. And if you declared the United States to be a white Christian state, definitionally, right, you have changed the status of everybody else. Never mind, as you say, lumping in the Palestinians, this is not a small caveat, right? Like, one of the main things that Israel has done to maintain its status as a Jewish state is rule over millions of people who, again, remember, official government policy is that they will never, ever not be ruled over, right? That there will never, ever be a Palestinian state. Netanyahu says that every 5 minutes, the Knesset passed resolution about it. And certainly Israel's actions over those 58 years are crystal clear on that point. You don't found cities of your own citizens in territory that you intend to give up, right? Nobody would do that. So it's like, so if you have millions of people who you permanently rule over without giving them citizenship, because giving them citizenship would mean that you lost your character as a Jewish state, then no, you're clearly not treating other people equally, right? Again, if everybody who lived in a territory has equal rights and equal status, then I think whether I'm part of the ethnic minority or the ethnic majority, shouldn't matter, right? If it matters to me, I don't think that that's legitimate, right? But I think it matters a great deal, if I'm given a officially de jure secondary status within the state, right? If you said, this is a Christian state, and then you'll be like a guest, and don't worry, you'll still be able to be all the things that people always say about Israeli Arabs, doctors, lawyers, Knesset members, right? You'll still be able to do all that stuff, don't worry, but it'll still be an officially Christian state, right? Then I would say, no, I'm not being treated as an equal.
Okay. I guess I think if you can vote, if you can run for office, if you can practice your own religion without interference, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, but I happen to live in a country that has an official narrative of like, yeah, like we like you, we protect your rights, you'll have the same rights in court as anyone else, but also, we don't want you to be in the majority. I don't feel like I'm dehumanized by that.
Really?
No, I don't think so.
That's incredible to me. Okay, I think that's
so. Yeah,
so
I've lived as a minority in multiple countries, including China. I hope China doesn't change its ethnic character. Like I like it, China as the Han state that it is. I might end up living there, soon, and I could imagine living there as a minority. Like I've got other problems with China's government, but it's not that.
So, I mean, it's an interesting example, right? Because China is not exactly notorious for its reasonable treatment of ethnic minority populations, right?
I do not endorse all of their policies,
okay.
Or even most of them.
No, I just maybe worth noting that it's not an obviously innocent example, right? But
sure.
I think that I think that if the United States, right, officially decreed, right, this is a white country, sure, we're not going to take away the right to vote from any non-white people, which would, by the way, already be a huge disanalogy to Israel, because Israel does deny millions of people that it's ruled over for 58 years the right to vote, solely because granting them that right would undermine its character as a Jewish state. That's the only reason. They don't hide it, right? They don't disguise it. They don't pretty it up, right? They're very open about that, right? So that would be a huge disanalogy. But even if you could somehow take that out of it, right? Even if the worst thing that that Israel did to anybody, right, were to say, right, that you guys have this officially unambiguously secondary status, right? You're okay to be here, but we want to be really sure that there are never too many of you, right? Then that does seem pretty obviously objectionable. I mean, like again, I mean, if the United States declared that that it was very important that it be a white country in perpetuity, it put it on all of its national documents. It put some formulation about being a white country. American politicians were constantly fretting openly about what would happen. About what we need to do to prevent there from ever being a non-white a non-white majority, or there's certain states that we should just maybe split off into a different country to make sure that the United States never has 51% non-white people. I think that most non-white people in the United States would be very bothered by that, and I think they would have a point.
Maybe, yeah. My kids are not totally white, so I'm not somebody who's obsessed with whiteness. Imposing that on America would destroy its civic nationalism, which I would not want. So I'd have to imagine a very different country than the one that I actually live in to imagine how that kind of nationalism would operate.
Well, hold on though, right? Like it's not just. I mean, this kind of reminds me of when in intro ethics classes, if I talk about the Judas Jarvis Thompson cases about killing healthy patients to harvest their organs, and there's always a student who says, "Oh, well, see, the reason that would be bad is because doctors take the Hippocratic Oath," right? And it's like, okay, well, yeah, but if we imagine a world where they took some other oath that that this wouldn't violate, right? I mean, that's surely not the main thing that's wrong with doing this, right? Similarly, it's like if I'm comparing the United States to some otherwise similar country that we just tweak its history enough that it doesn't have a history of civic nationalism, right? It has some totally different history, right? And the end result is we have on the one hand the United States, and we have on the other hand an otherwise similar country that declares itself to be officially, right, to be a white ethno state, right? This is a white country. It's a openly declared goal of public policy to make sure there's never a non-white majority. Like, I would think just comparing those two, regardless of how either of them came about, right? I mean, this seems vastly normatively preferable to that. I mean, would you not agree with that?
I'd have to see the country. I'd have to see it fleshed out in enough detail. I'd have to see how they treated their actual minorities that were really there. How much of, I just think you're underestimating the sense that people need something. They need something to feel that they've got like a common narrative. And I want to know what you think that would be if the Israelis and the Palestinians were like merged into one nation here. By the way, I don't think they're just excluded on the basis of ethnicity / religion. I know people probably say that, but I think they're actually thinking that as a proxy for a bunch of other things. Like you could imagine an example where instead of Palestinians, imagine you've got a division where you've got a bunch of Jewish people in the West Bank, and in Gaza, but they really, really, really hate the state of Israel and the people living there. I don't think they would just say, okay, I guess it's fine. I guess you share our religion, you share our ethnicity. I guess we should just like extend citizenship to all of you. No,
Well,
that would be a disaster. They don't share a common narrative.
Nobody is excluded because they hate Israel. They hate Israel because of the decades and decades of being ruled over as permanent non-citizen subjects, deprived of all legal and human rights, subject to military rule, having every aspect of their lives controlled by Israel. Because look, before that, it's not like this is some different group with a different history than so-called Israeli Arabs, right? I mean, like Israeli Arabs that's just the name that we give to Palestinians who ended up on the Israeli side of the line after 1948, right? I mean, that they have that's like, it's the same people, right? I mean, it's not like there's some, it's not that, the only difference, right? I mean, to the extent that it's even true that you have fundamentally different attitudes, right, among Palestinians in the West Bank, for example, than Palestinian citizens of Israel. Which is, I would note, by the way, from the polling I've seen, at least, that's unclear to me that you do, right? But it's that's certainly, when they, pollsters ask people, right, would you, like, what would your ideal, solution be, right? Like there's would it be, a two-state solution, a one-state solution with equal rights for everybody, or a one-state solution that, excludes, the other group. That last one is much more popular in Israel than it is in the Palestinian territories. But like, even to the extent that it is true, right? It's like, look, it's true because of the way that people are brutalized there. Because like, otherwise, what's the alternate explanation? I mean, like, it can't be some like deep cultural fact about Palestinians on the West Bank as opposed to Palestinians who live within the Green Line, because I mean, culturally, I mean, that's the exact same group. I mean, you like those only start to diverge after the foundation of the state of Israel, and in fact, right, I mean, like they have, these are still interconnected enough groups that that like Israel feels the need to do things like pass laws to discourage Palestinian citizens of Israel from marrying Palestinians in the West Bank and living together as a married couple, in Israel, allegedly for security reasons. But this is like, they're very interconnected groups. I mean, you're talking about, oftentimes literally cousins, right? So it's like why? Like,
well, I mean, some of the views of the Israeli Arabs are also concerning, right? I mean, a lot of them, voted for the Communist Party, do not vote for parties that are opposed to the state of Israel. It's fairly astonishing, like that Israel extended its citizenship to so many Arabs, following the wars of 48 and 67.
Well, it's following the war in 67. Between 48 and 67, that they had not extended citizenship to that population.
Okay, fair enough.
I think it was like 66.
But it was from, but the population that was in the territory conquered during that war.
So, but hold on, I don't think that's amazing. I think that if they hadn't done that, right, there's no way that they would have been able to maintain, Western support over the decades, right? I mean, like, this is like, if you just had said, okay, nobody, like, no Arabs on either side of this line, right? Get citizenship rights, then there's just there's no rhetorical tap dancing around the fact that this is a form of apartheid, right? I would argue that what exists now is absolutely a form of apartheid, right? But like, there'd just be no debate about it. There'd just be no denying it if that were the case, right? Like, it just would not be able to have any sort of legitimacy or support in the West. Whereas if you maintain the official pretense that it's like, well, everybody who lives within this line, right, is kind of sort of equal, but then we're just denying this to these millions of people in these territories, and especially during the decades of peace process, right? That was a lot easier for Western apologists to rationalize, right? Because they say, okay, well, sure, those people don't have to be citizens of Israel. They'll eventually be citizens of something else. I mean, if they just said, nope, no Arabs can be citizens of Israel, then at that point,
that was never the original idea. No citizens can ever be Arabs can ever be citizens of Israel. But do you imagine that an Arab majority state, or a state evenly divided between Arabs and Jews, you think that would be a peaceful arrangement given the history as it has unfolded?
Yeah, I think it would be vastly more peaceful than what exists right now. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
I don't understand how you could think that.
Okay. I think that again, I mean, I'm sure that would be, I'm sure that it would be fraught and messy in the way that post-apartheid South Africa has been, but the same way that outside of Elon Musk's fantasy life, right, that like by and large, white people there are okay, right? I think that if you have a situation where you have millions of people who have to be, at least if Israel is going to have the borders that it's held since decades before you or I were born, right? That you have millions of people who have to be permanently denied citizenship rights, that you have, and are living under military rule forever, and you have millions of other people around the world who aren't allowed to come back, etc. I think that's a recipe for permanent ethnic conflict. I think that if you have a situation where you have what you actually would have, by the way, right, if you just did, right, the dreaded one-state solution. You just gave citizenship to everybody who lived within Israel's current borders, right? Which, again, in other contexts, we would just say sounds like a functional definition of democracy. Everybody within your borders is a citizen. But if you just did that, right, and you stopped preventing refugees from coming back, then you would have approximately equal numbers of Arab and Jewish citizens. And honestly, if you want a recipe for a country that has as little oppression as possible of either of the two groups, right, then, the fact that, Judaism would be the plurality religion within the state, right, because enough Palestinians are Christians, that, that this is, that it would be impossible to have like a stable parliamentary majority, without support from the other ethnic community. I mean, if you wanted, there's no guarantee, of course, but yeah, if you wanted a recipe for, for something with vastly less oppression of either group, I don't think you could ask for better than approximately equal numbers of both.
Okay. Can you think of any country that has been, where you've got two groups of people that have been in a quasi state of war for 70 years and just merging and everything's fine? Do we have, is South Africa your best example of something close to that?
I mean, I think it's an obvious parallel example, and I think the thing I like about South Africa is that it's not merging, right? I mean, merging is inaccurate here because merging suggests that you have two states right now, and then you merge them, right? What you've had is a single state, from the river to the sea since 1967, And the proposition on the table is just giving people equal rights. And so I think when you have a singular state in which a large portion of the population was denied equal rights for not as long, right? It wasn't 70 years, but that's just because apartheid in South Africa collapsed sooner. It actually started about the same time that Israel did in the late 40s. But for several decades, I think South Africa is not a bad example. I think that I think that if it's not clear to me what the other examples are that would be similar enough in their starting conditions for them to be relevant one way or the other here.
I mean, the South Africa example is not particularly encouraging. Things turned out as well as they did, in part because you had an extraordinary leader, Nelson Mandela. Like, extraordinary leaders don't grow on trees. You're probably not going to get one of those. But still, things are not great. Things are not super great in South Africa right now.
So let's pause on that. Well, but there's certainly a lot better than there. I mean, it is better to be either a black or a white South African. It is not only better to be either a black or a white South African than to be a Palestinian. It's so much better that the two don't even belong in the same conversation, right? So, I mean, I think if we're going to compare better and worse, as messy and awful as many things about South Africa are, I think that is going to be relevant. But I just want to pause on your Nelson Mandela point, right? Because this seems important to me, right? Like, imagine that the ANC had been either defeated or co-opted in some way, right? And so the main force that was engaged in armed struggle against the apartheid government in South Africa was something much less pleasant than the ANC, right? As I'm sure you can easily imagine, right? That they have maybe we're talking about some sort of like really, awful group of, Black nationalist Christian fundamentalists or something, right? Then sure, you'd be much less enthusiastic about that group, right? Than you might have been about the ANC, right? You wouldn't support that group, right? The way you might have supported the ANC. But I think you wouldn't say, okay, let's keep apartheid.
I don't know what I'd say. It sounds like a terrible choice, and I would probably try to get out of that situation as quickly as possible.
Well, I mean, like let's say as an American, right? Like that they have so you're out of the situation, except perhaps on the question of whether the United States should be sending money and guns and bombs to Johannesburg, right, to help prop up this government, right? Like, I think that the absence of a Nelson Mandela, I mean, we agree this would be a terrible historical tragedy, but I mean, like it wouldn't remove, I think, the horrifying injustice of South African apartheid.
No. Let's see.
Well, while you're thinking about that, I did just want to go back to what you were saying earlier, because you said that without sort of an ethnic peoplehood definition of nation, right? What would there be to sort of bind people together as a national group, right? And I was kind of hoping when we had to hit a lull here to go back and explore that point, like because I'm curious, right? Because like both like why, like if you had something that wouldn't be as strong a sort of communal glue as common ethnicity is, it could be that you just then get, in Israel or in any society, right? Because it did sound like your defense of Israel is linked to sort of a much more general defense of nationalism and
sure,
some degree of national homogeneity, right? Like what's the why is that bad, right? Like if for the sake of argument, right, you do get less of a glue, right? So people feel sort of less bought in to the national project because they lack that. is that such a bad outcome? I mean, like in other words, if like having nationalism everywhere that were more civic and less ethno just kind of in the long run just meant that there was much less nationalism in the world, is that a bad thing?
I think it'd probably be a bad thing if there were, well, if there were less patriotism in the world. I think, I think we expect people to make sacrifices for the greater good of the country. Like, and this is the version of patriotism I want to emphasize, and I emphasize in my book is like America first. I don't mean America first, like first among other countries. I mean, put it above yourself, put it above your party, put it above your career interests, put the country first in front of those things. And a country, like a world where there's less nationalism, where there's less patriotism, you've got less people doing that, right? I mean, Trump tried to steal an election in 2020. I admit that. It's kind of surprising, don't you think, that it hasn't happened more often? A little bit. Like, it's not for lack of wanting to win that it doesn't happen more often. What stops that? What prevents politicians from all the time just refusing to concede elections or trying to win by illegitimate means? Well, there's some community that they feel a part of and feel responsible to. And those mechanisms just won't work if people don't feel like they're part of that community. So I think of democracy differently than you do. In fact, I'd like to hear how you define it, because I think of a democracy like rule of the people. And I think, well, if you got two peoples, you should have, there ought to be, you got to have different governments, different systems of voting, right?
Well, if peoples means ethnic groups, then yeah, I guess.
It doesn't have to mean that. It doesn't have to mean that.
Well,
but they have to see themselves as a people, whether it be based on ethnicity or whatever else.
Well, I mean, people see themselves like, I mean, what people see themselves as often changes dramatically over time as, as national arrangements change, right? That if, you people go from being, from seeing themselves as Sicilians to seeing themselves as Italians. There was a point where a lot of people actually did make a big deal of identifying as Yugoslavians rather than Serbs or Croats or whatever, and that seemed much better to the extent that happened, like in every way. But no, I would say that democracy. Right, democracy means that the rule of the people in the sense of everybody who lives in the state, right? That they have what makes something.
So what defines the limits of the state?
Well, I mean the limits of the state, if that's meant literally, like the borders of the state, right? Like why are the states the borders that they have? I mean, usually that comes out of history. That's imposed on you by other states, right? That you try. You try to snatch, more than you have right now, you get pushed back on, or you're successful in it and you've expanded it. Usually it's hopelessly arbitrary and historically contingent and weird, right? The fact that there is a part of the United States that, that borders on Russia and, isn't anywhere near the rest of the United States. And, and then there's like part of the United States that's like this tropical thing on the other side of the world, right, is incredibly strange, right? But I mean, that's just kind of the contingent result of history. But I think however the borders get to be the way that it is, whether that's because, you're some small European nation after World War I or World War II, and, people more powerful than you drew weird borders, or because of the success of some nationalist movement, or because of whatever, right? Like, I think that, what makes something a democracy is that everybody within those borders has equal control over the state, right? I mean, democracy, right, means that the people who live there aren't just subjects of the state; they're citizens. They have that, like, they are equally ruling over the state, right? At least in the ideal, that's what democracy is, right? I mean, that's why we would say, for example, that the United States was, much less of a democracy when when Black people and lots of it weren't allowed to vote, right? That it's much more of a democracy now than it was then, because you had people who lived there who didn't have these sort of exercisable rights to political influence over the state. I mean, that seems like what we mean by democracy. I mean, I don't like whether or not that they sort of all of the people in that state, right, are in some sense or another, right, even think of themselves as a people, right, doesn't by itself, I think, tell me anything about how democratic it is, right? I mean, that they have if Trump succeeded somehow in making Canada the 51st state, and it could be that after that happened, right, the vast majority of Canadians were unhappy with that arrangement, and
just give them one vote in the Electoral College.
Yeah. I guess it'd have to be at least two, right? But that's like if they had if the vast majority of Canadians didn't want to be Americans, didn't think of themselves as Americans, okay, that might be normatively objectionable for that reason. But assuming that they really did have just as many democratic rights as Americans, that they, as people who would actually think of themselves as Americans, I would still say that the result was a democracy. I mean, like I could understand arguing maybe even, to the extent that you're saying, oh, democracy won't be viable over time, right, without a sense of peoplehood or something like that, right? Like I could understand that argument. I don't know that I agree with it, but I can certainly understand how you come to that conclusion. I can't understand saying that what democracy is something that's in some, ethereal sense a people exercising control over something.
I don't think it's particularly ethereal. It's got vague boundaries. But I'm not talking about some Hegelian essence or whatever. But I mean,
so you just made subjective feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what a sense of collective identity is. It's socially constructed. It's based out of feelings. It's like currency, right? Currency is not out there in the world like gold would be, but as a unit of exchange, that would be something we create. The same thing with national identity. I think it's the same thing.
So let me just ask, right? Because you said something interesting a few minutes ago. You said that you attributed the fact that relatively few people have stolen elections or tried to steal elections. I guess two in the last quarter century, right? But whatever, relatively few overall, to sort of widespread sense of patriotism, identification with a national project. I mean, let's just assume for the sake of argument that is the correct explanation. If that's true, and it's true in the United States, a country where nationality has been extraordinarily pried apart from ethnicity, I mean, isn't that sort of hopeful in terms of the prospects for the stuff about patriotism that you value, not relying on ethnic peoplehood?
To an extent, but I worry that we're stretching that resource kind of thin. I'm an immigration restrictionist. I think there's kind of been too much change too quickly, and I have the worry that we might not be able to sustain that indefinitely. But it's good that it's telltale now. It's good that it's telltale now.
Okay, but I mean, is that why? Is that I don't know. I mean, I think lots of people believe the 1960 election was stolen by Kennedy. I don't know if that's really true or not, but that's a widespread, claim. Lots of people, of whom I would include myself, would say the same thing about Bush v. Gore. Then you get go back to the 19th century. You've got Hayes, right? And then in the 21st century.
Oh yeah, Hayes was definitely stolen.
Yeah, and then in the 21st century, you've got this sort of very incompetent attempt by Trump in 2020. I mean, it's kind of seems to me, looking over that, I mean, first blush, I mean, maybe you spent more time thinking about this than I have, but I mean, like, first blush, looking over that, it seems like, okay, it's not super common, but I mean, this is something that, every once in a while somebody will take a stab at doing. I mean, do you think that, like, the most recent instance of it was because of too weak a cultural identity, because we let in too many immigrants? There's some sort of causal
Well,
relationship.
indirectly, I think. Yeah, I mean,
So,
I I
yeah,
think
spell that
there's
out.
I just think there's a breakdown of norms. People are anxious about like what America is, what the meaning of their American identity is. I think they're more likely to glom on to leaders in a certain way, and the people. I think mainly I think it's happened through political polarization. But immigration is one of the issues that has sort of galvanized that. But people are like the rhetoric, the breakdown of norms. People sort of it's not on exactly on ethnic lines, and I'm glad it's not, because then we'd have an even bigger problem on our hands. But it's on political lines. The sense of common identity is breaking down, and people are more likely to break the rules when they think like the other side is an unjust sort of occupier, and like the American side is just our side, the other side is an interloper. That gets into some really dangerous territory. And
So I mean, like, certainly, if you think about the countries around the world that have that are most authoritarian, and certainly the ones that have done like big democratic backsliding, and like, used to be somewhat more democratic, and are now much more authoritarian. These, like, it certainly doesn't seem like, I mean, maybe this isn't necessary for what you're saying, but it certainly doesn't seem like a common thread is that, like, they're ones, the less ethnically homogenous countries, they're more likely to do that. I mean, if anything, at least at kind of a casual glance, it seems like that happens more in more ethnically homogenous countries. I mean, that, I don't know, it's like, Viktor Orban's Hungary, that's, any number of like post-Soviet states, that, Israel, for that matter, right? I mean, and I'm not even talking about, like, I would argue it's never been much of a democracy, right? I mean, that's our big disagreement, but like, but even in terms of democracy for Jewish Israelis, right? I mean, that they have I mean, there were like unprecedented mass protests, in like the summer of 2023, because of the sense that Netanyahu was consolidating like lots and lots of personal power in ways that undermined democracy for Jewish Israelis, right? So it seems like, certainly, at least ethnic homogeneity doesn't seem to be like a safeguard against this, right? So is that consistent with saying that there's like a good reason to think that the decline of it is going to make it more likely to happen?
Let's see. I think a firm sense of identity, it's a necessary but insufficient condition
Okay.
for well-functioning institutions. And in some of these places, there never was any kind of tradition of limited power for any kind of identity to sustain in the first place. So it's not surprising that they haven't developed.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, like, it just, it doesn't seem like, I mean, like, it seems to me that that the United States has actually in many ways become much more democratic over the decades of being of being less homogenous. It's I mean, maybe, I guess, if you think that, like, if you think that a strong sense of identity is undermined by becoming too ethnically heterogeneous, and that a strong sense of identity is like a necessary but not sufficient condition for like sort of resisting democratic backsliding, then I can like maybe understand how the view is consistent with all of this. but I guess I have a much harder time seeing what the sort of positive case is for it.
I see. Let's see. I just think I think we underestimate, or at least a lot of political theorists, I think, underestimate the psychological role the state plays for people, and you don't hear a lot. This is something I want to investigate more from a book on patriotism. You don't hear a lot of discussion about things like national holidays, national heroes, all that stuff is whatever. That's what the state does is distribute resources and enforce laws and stuff like that. But it's interesting how universal these sorts of things are. People want some kind of larger narrative to identify with. And if the state isn't providing them, if they don't feel like it's their narrative, I feel like they'll find it elsewhere. They'll find it in something maybe more hostile.
Well, I mean, I hope not, because then we might end up with exclusionary ethno-states, which is what I wouldn't want. But yeah, and certainly once we get to my first choice, which is the global socialist superstate, we'll make sure to have lots of official heroes of that state, and people will, with any luck, put it above their own interests. But these are obviously all points of perfect consensus between us. All right. Spencer, we are about at time. Are there any last points that you've just kind of been itching to make as soon as there was an opening in the conversation that you'd like to make on your way out?
Oh man, so we didn't even get to the Gaza war. Look, I'll just say I lived in Egypt for a while. People would talk to me about the Israel-Palestine conflict, when they knew that I was an American who spoke Arabic. And I had a lot of discussions with people about this. I became really disturbed by the level of anti-Semitism I saw. You could find Mein Kampf sold in small, somebody selling 20 books on the corner. And it's there it is in Arabic. Kafahi is the Arabic name. And Protocols of the Elders of Zion. People would use Jew as a curse word. I have to imagine that sort of thing is more intense in Gaza or the West Bank. I have to imagine.
I mean, if you've been occupied by somebody for 58 years, then yeah. I mean, I think that I think it does lead to predictable cycles of ethnic hostility. I mean, I would point out that a lot of what you're describing is stuff that's also very, very, very common in Israel, right? As far as really extreme anti-Arab sentiment. I mean, I remember just reading that from Ryan Graham at Dropsite News a little over a week ago about an unarmed Israeli Arab who was shot by a Jewish Israeli in the streets in Jerusalem while a crowd chanted "Death for Arabs," and an Israeli judge let the killer go. Police then picked up the Palestinian man, or sorry, not the killer. He didn't die, right? But he did survive, and he was then picked up by the police and asked why he was out so late. I mean, so it's look, I think everything that you're describing, seems like really good evidence to me that Egypt is not the sort of society that we should want, right? That having this kind of that there are many things about Egypt that are very different from what we would think of as a good society. But I guess I'm much more confused about why we should think that Israel is a good society either. I mean, it seems like both of these places, certainly fall very far short of any kind of cosmopolitan democratic ideal. And that seems like a good reason to criticize both of them.
I mean, I think the far right Israelis are going to be a barrier to merging these societies into one in the way you would suggest. They're a problem too. I think that's just a further reason to think that there's not going to be a shared narrative between these groups of people, and just say, okay, you're all citizens of the same state. I don't think that's going to work out. I am resolutely skeptical of your proposal, but I appreciate the the humane intentions behind it. But
my first choice would just be extending democratic rights to everybody who lives within the current already merged state, right? My second,
Palestinian Authority and Hamas don't exist now.
The Palestinian Authority and Hamas exist, but that doesn't mean they're independent states.
Quasi-independent states.
No, they're not quasi-independent states. They're not in any sense independent. I mean, this is like, Gaza from, the so-called disengagement to 2023, had, it's like there's no sense in which you could call that, quasi-independent. I mean, if you have your air, land, and sea borders are being patrolled by somebody else's army, they decide everything that comes in and out, they penetrate into it at will, they bomb it at will. You are in danger of being shot by that army if you walk too close to your border. I mean, that's not a quasi-independent state.
Sure it is. It's a beleaguered state. Why isn't it quasi-independent?
It's not. How is that quasi-independent? That's nothing close to independence. I mean, that's like, that is a state. That is territory that is being thoroughly controlled by the state that currently claims it, that if it ever tried to do the things that independent states do, right, would certainly not be allowed to. I mean, right, it's like, there's the, if you built like, oh, this is our Palestinian army base, right? I mean, that certainly wouldn't be, that certainly wouldn't be allowed. I mean, this is like, if you can't enter or leave it, without permission from Israel. I mean, that's
Egypt.
Egypt is, Egypt is bought off in order to go along with this. I mean, there's a reason why Egypt is historically the second biggest, aid recipient, right? I mean, it's precisely in order to bribe its dictatorship into acting as an adjunct to the Israeli occupation, right? But it's like, if you have, this is not anywhere like close enough to independence that we could use words like quasi, in a sort of sensible way, right? So it's like, yeah, I would say there's been a single state from the river to the sea for, again, since decades before either you or I were born, and that, normatively, the first choice would be to extend democratic rights to everybody in that state. If we just, and, whether or not that will ever end up happening or not, I don't know. I think I don't know how many people would have predicted in the mid '80s that that South African apartheid was a few years away from falling. So I think that like tomorrow, next year, no, I don't think so. Right? Like is this is that ever going to change? I don't feel like I'm confident enough to say it. But look, assume for the sake of argument that it is, right. So we can't have our normative first choice, right? Like I think the second choice would be at least, withdrawing to the pre-1967 borders. So at least in the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine, you can have like a real two-state solution with a real independent Palestinian state with a Palestinian army and a Palestinian navy and all of that stuff, right? That actually acts like a state, rather than the sort of bad joke that's been historically offered of some, demilitarized Palestinian semi-state that would be pockmarked with Israeli, settlements and Israeli roads, patrolled by Israeli soldiers that, would be, predictably would be routinely bombed, by Israel, because of course it would, right? I mean, that's like, if you had like a real two-state solution of the kind that was never on the table, I don't think that would be as, I think ethnic partition has been a disaster all around the world, from, India to Ireland, that's a, Yugoslavia, right? I think it pretty much always leads to bad things. So I think it'd be a second choice, but it's like, yeah, I think that at least doing a real partition to do a real two-state solution so Palestinians could finally be citizens of something, right? Like I would take that if that, if that became possible. I think that the sort of like the real kind of the real lodestar of all this is just like, look, you can't rule over millions of people without giving them rights in your state. I mean, that there's nothing could justify that.
I think we're at the agree to disagree point. I think
All right. Well, we will do that then. Yeah. Sorry, I think that's the point where I said, well, I don't agree to that. Okay. Yeah, we'll do that. So, Spencer, do you want to remind people where they can find your various works, your podcast, your writing, all that stuff?
Yeah. So spencercasephilosophy.com is my website, which I haven't updated. I need to do that. And Micro-Digressions with a hyphen is my podcast. I'm going to do an episode on a free will debate later this week. So I hope you can tune in for that. And thanks for having me, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Spencer. Pleasure as always. We will do it again soon. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.